So I just put that out there. I think the more interesting conversation is not to talk about how apes like ourselves could have gotten religion, but to talk about what we should do given the way the world is now and what we seem to know about it through science.
Well, that's fine. I just want to make a couple of comments about that. I mean, the hypothesis that I'm proposing is certainly not dependent on group selection. So we can leave that one aside as far as I think the jury's out on the ultimate validity of the idea of group selection, but I'm not interested in going down that rabbit hole because it doesn't matter to me one way or another really how that's resolved. With regards to the potential validity of evolutionarily derived motivations to the present day, I think that's more complicated. So the first thing I would say is that I believe there has been a central march forward with a set of very productive ideas as human beings have evolved their morality, but those have spun off counterproductive evolutionary dead ends like everything does. And it's possible, for example, that celibacy is one of those. With regards to the donation to sperm bank idea, I mean, that's essentially the mosquito way of propagation, right? And it's R versus K. Is that the correct terminology? I don't remember it correctly, but there's two fundamentally different strategies, extreme strategies for propagating yourself in the world. And one is to disseminate yourself as widely as possible and let the offspring live or die as they may, which would be the sperm bank approach. And then there's the other one, which is high investment in children, which is maybe taken to its extreme in human beings. And so we're tilted a lot more towards that. And so you can't really imagine a human being being motivated to take the mosquito approach because that's really not built into us. But that isn't to say that the sexual morality that's part and parcel of our being, which seems to tend relatively strongly towards monogamy, for example, as marriage is a human universal, although there are variations of it, we're still very much tilted towards the high investment in single offspring pattern. So
let me just clarify one point. I certainly am not saying that you can't see the thumbprint of evolution in more or less everything we do. You obviously can. And as you point out, our sexual morality and our commitment to monogamy, all of that is amenable to being interpreted in evolutionary terms. No doubt those stories are valid and interesting to understand. My point is that we are in the process of repudiating and struggling to outgrow most of what evolution has prepared us to want and care about and fear. Tribalism, xenophobia, and the list is long, but we want to get out of our tribal violence program and all the rest.
Let me address that because, you see, most of the evolutionary psychologists that I've encountered have what I consider the misbegotten notion that our primary period of evolutionary determination was on the African veldt. And my viewpoint, I would say, spans broader time spans than that. So I'm starting from the presupposition that the most permanent things are the most real, which I think is a reasonable starting point. But I have a reason for saying that, because what I've been able to understand by delving deeply into the grammatical structure underneath mythology is that the religious landscape actually describes that which is most permanent in what shaped human evolutionary history. And I mean way back. I mean 350 million years back, before trees, before flowers, back when we shared common ancestor with crustaceans. And so one of the most permanent features of the biological landscape is the existence of the dominance hierarchy. And that's roughly portrayed in religious mythology as culture or explored territory or the known. And it's usually given the characterological representation of the great father. And there's a positive one and a negative one, as the dominance hierarchy can support you in your development or crush you completely. So the dominance hierarchy is one major selection mechanism, and it's known territory. There's another major selection mechanism, which is roughly speaking Mother Nature, and that's that which exists outside of explored territory. And it's generally been kept conceptualized as feminine, and I think the reason for that is because it's the unknown cognitively speaking or territorially speaking, that gives rise to new forms. But it's also more importantly that female human beings, so the feminine, plays a very vicious role in the selection process. You may know, and probably do, that you have twice as many female ancestors as male ancestors. So as far as human beings are concerned, the feminine is a bottleneck through which genes must pass, so to speak. And it's a very narrow and picky and choosy bottleneck. So it has a positive element and a negative element. So roughly, it's the same thing, Sam, that's represented in the Taoist yin-yang symbol, because that yin-yang symbol basically is predicated on the idea that being is partly the known or the interpretive structure that's brought to bear on the situation. And so that's the white paisley, it's a serpent actually, and the unknown, which is the black paisley or serpent, and the two are interchangeable, and out of them arises meaning. So the idea behind the Taoist symbol is that you should have 1 foot in what you know and 1 foot in what you don't know, and that's the place where information flow is maximized. And that's the same thing as occupying the position of the hero who confronts the unknown and generates new information. And those evolutionary realities remain absolutely unchanged. The idea that every place you go, there's something you know and an interpretive framework that you bring to bear. So there's a cultural element, and everywhere you go or are, there's something that transcends that knowledge that you have to deal with. And everywhere you go, you're there. And so the three basic archetypal characters of mythology are the individual, positive and negative, culture, positive and negative, and nature, positive and negative. And we haven't outgrown that in the least. It's exactly the same problem it's always been. And as far as I can tell, it's exactly the same set of problems that always will be. And that's partly why these archetypal stories cannot be transcended, and they cannot be ignored. They pop up of their own accord. I mean, look, I'll give you an example.
One question, Jordan. Yeah. How is any of that religious, though? I understand how, thinking of the individual versus the cosmos gives us a kind of narrative structure, right? You have your protagonist and you have all of the things that can happen to him or not, and all the things that he can want or not. And it's very easy to conceive of any human life or the life of a whole civilization in terms of stories like that. But how does this bring religion into the picture?
Okay, well, I'm going to approach that from two perspectives. The first perspective, I presume, is one that you might find interesting given your interest in spirituality. So it's certainly capable for people to experience deeply a sense of meaning. Csikszentmihalyi talked about that as flow, which I think is a rather trivial way of dealing with it, but at least it's one that people can directly understand. But I would say you can understand when you're doing something meaningful because you're deeply engaged in it, and you also have a sense, in some sense, of standing outside of time because you don't notice time's flow. And it also feels worthwhile, and that the sacrifices that you have made to enable yourself to do that were justified. And so I would say, because the ultimate domains of reality are in fact chaos and order, or known and unknown, that when you straddle those two properly and maximize information flow, you feel a deep sense of intrinsic meaning. And that's the output of the entire structure of your consciousness telling you that you're in the right place at the right time with regards to furthering your capacity to thrive and move forward.
如果您也喜欢这样的生活智慧，请帮我按赞、订阅并打开小铃铛。您的关注是我们最大的动力。